Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Science of B2B podcast. I'm your host, Kerry Cunningham. And if it's your first time visiting the podcast, thanks for coming. Appreciate it. We've got a couple other episodes we've already done, so please check out those if you haven't. If you're returning, thank you for returning, and I hope you enjoy this episode. All right, so let's get right into it. Today, the episode is called The Junk in Your B2B Trunk. Hang with me for a couple of minutes on this one. I think you'll find it's worth it. What we'll really be talking about today are the signals that are available to most typical B2B organizations, signals that could dramatically improve your pipeline and revenue productivity effectiveness, but which don't because you're not using them. We'll start with a story by way of analogy, though. This one comes from a favorite topic area of mine, human genomics. Now, the project to decode the human genome was begun in earnest in 1990, and it was completed in 2003. Importantly, in the early days of genomics, the belief was that a gene essentially coded for one trait, one gene, one trait, like gene for eye color, gene for leg length. Now, we still tend to talk about genes that way, as a gene for whatever trait or characteristic that we're thinking about. But we know it doesn't work that way anymore. So when the work started, wagers had the human genome coming in at about 100,000 genes over under. And that figure was reached by comparison with known genomes, such as the fruit fly. Fruit fly has about 14,000 genes. The mouse seemed to have about 25,000. So the estimates in the 100,000 range seemed pretty reasonable. But when the draft genome was finished, the initial measure was just about 30,000. And this was a shock to most. After all, how could we have just the same number of genes as a mouse? But that meant also that only about 3% of the DNA in our genome was devoted to these genes. Like very little of our genome was actually genes. And at first, we didn't know what the rest of the DNA was doing, or if it was doing anything. And for the most part, it was labeled junk. And we probably all know the term or have heard the term junk DNA. Over time, however, experiments plus a lot better DNA decoding techniques started to reveal a lot more. For example, one set of experiments took a gene that was known to be involved in building eyes in a fruit fly. And they substituted that gene for the eye-making gene in a mouse embryo. And to everybody's astonishment, the mouse developed with normal mouse eyes. I mean, how cool is that? But also, how is that? Well, as it turns out, some genes act like master controllers that turn on and off other genes, or really whole sets of genes. In the mouse and the fly experiment, the make an eye controlling gene turns on the right set of genes to make an eye, whether it's in a mouse or in a fly. Probably also in us, but that will never happen except in sci-fi films. The key is, you make small changes in how these genes work, though, and you can produce very different results. So small changes in these controller genes can produce very, very different outcomes later on. In time, researchers discovered that about 25 or so % of the DNA in our genome that isn't part of a gene also does other work. It regulates when genes are turned on and off. It provides structure for that to happen, all the mechanisms that work inside a cell to transcribe DNA, and otherwise helps maintain and police how the actual gene sequences work. So, not all the junk was junk. And by the way, well over half of the genome does still seem to be junk, and we know a lot about it at this point. But the 25% or so of the DNA sequences that aren't junk determine how the actual genes really work. So you cannot know how genes work without knowing how that other part of the genome, the part that isn't actual genes, works. You could think of it like a set of ingredients. So you've been given a set of ingredients and the instructions are to make a meal. You can do what you want with the ingredients, and you can probably add a couple of other things here and there if you like. The meal you make could differ dramatically from what I might make. Or you might be able to make many different meals from the same ingredients yourself, depending upon how you combine them, when you combine them, how you process them, how you heat, cool, grind, whatever else you do to them. And that's how it can be true that as humans, every person on the planet has on average 99.9% of our genes in common. We're basically all the same at the genetic level. But we also share 96% of our genes with a chimpanzee, and 85% of our genes can also be found in a mouse. Now, the one that blew my mind when I first heard about it was that we share 44% of our genes with bananas. Bananas. That's bananas. All right, so if you're starting to wonder what the point of all of this is, well, that's really it. In genomics, we used to think that genomes are all genes, but we know better now. In B2B, We all know that only about 3% or so of our web visitors fill out forms. That leaves us with something like 97% of our web traffic that we have long considered junk, or at least we've just ignored it. But for those who have already started to make use of modern data science and AI, you know that the visitors hidden away in your non-MQL leads and in your anonymous web traffic are a lot like that portion of the genome that directs traffic and helps make sense of the genes. For an illustration of how those non-MQL leads and anonymous traffic work together to help you make sense of these things, we'll have a future episode where we'll conduct a couple of thought experiments to make that case. But the net of that discussion is this: nearly all of your web visitors remain anonymous. Most of those visitors are not relevant to the buying processes that are meaningful at any given time. But probably something like 25 to 40% of your anonymous traffic is relevant to in-flight buying processes. And if you de-anonymize your web traffic to the best of your ability, what you will find is that it is very lumpy. Now, we talk about that in a later episode as well. With some accounts sending lots of people to your website and others just sending one. If you look into your leads data in marketing automation, something else you're treating as junk, then what you'll find is that it is also very lumpy. Even your MQLs will be lumpy, with many solo visitors, but also many groups showing up. So by lumpy, I mean 1 here, 2 here, 3 here, 4 there. It's the combination of de-anonymized traffic and groupish leads and MQLs that together get you to the point where you can see which organizations are actually in market for your solutions. All right, so here are the key points to take away from this discussion. 1, genomics is really cool. And things are not what we thought they were. They're much more complex and much cooler than we ever thought. If you are MQL-centric, you are only making use of maybe 2-3% of the available buying signals, but maybe a lot less than that. Even if you add in non-MQLs to the mix, you're still probably only using 3 to 5% of the available signals. Second, third point, most of your anonymous traffic is junk. But the 25 to 40% of your anonymous traffic that isn't junk will absolutely allow you to prioritize your marketing spend and your sales rep effort and time to become dramatically more effective in generating pipeline and revenue, which is kind of why we're here. All right, so next time we'll do something different. We're going to play a game. We may play 2 or 3 games, and they'll get at this point in a different way. So check it out next time. Till then, take care, and we'll see you next week.